Tonight we're doing something a little strange. You're going to tiptoe with me into an 18th century garden, not just any garden, mind you, but one where the vegetables make sounds. That's right. Whispers from the cabbages, groans from the kale, a low squeak from the turnip patch. You pause, thinking maybe it's the wind, but the gardener swears the lettuce cried last night. Welcome to a world where people didn't just plant vegetables, they listened to them. You probably won't survive this if you expect rational science or modern logic, so go ahead and set those down for now. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I always love to know where you're listening from. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You duck beneath a stone archway, into a garden bathed in moonlight. The year is 1743. Somewhere in Central Europe. The air smells like damp soil and overripe herbs, and the quiet buzz of distant insects hums against your ears. But beneath that, something else, quieter, stranger. You freeze. Did that cabbage just whimper? It's easy to scoff now, but in the 18th century, many didn't. Gardens were believed to be alive, not just biologically, but emotionally. And that belief came with ears pricked. Certain vegetables were said to make noise when plucked, or more alarmingly, when left alone. You creep past rows of red cabbage, half expecting one to cough. One's leaves flutter in the breeze, or was it a sigh? Nighttime, back then, was when vegetables were at their most expressive. People didn't just fear wolves or thieves in the dark, they feared moaning celery and chatty parsley. That sounds absurd until you consider the context. Superstition hadn't yet finished packing its bags and vacating the minds of even the educated. This was a time when electricity was still magic, and medicine still involved leeches and ghost blood. So if a tomato groaned on a foggy evening, that made perfect sense to someone. You tread further into the garden. A journal from 1739, belonging to a French herbalist named Etienne Marchot, mentions hearing faint whimpers while harvesting lettuce near dusk. He described the sound as a low, delicate keening, as of a maiden in quiet protest. You pause. That sounds unnecessarily poetic. But Marchot was a respected figure, consulted by minor nobility. He wasn't joking. He also noted that certain vegetables were more vocal during the waning moon. His theory: vegetables contained mists of the soul, and in phases of lunar weakening, these mists could escape, briefly, in the form of murmurs. Yes. He wrote that with a straight quill. The belief wasn't universal, of course, but it lingered across a surprising swath of Europe. Especially in rural Germany, where folktales blended seamlessly into what passed for agricultural advice. Local farming guides occasionally included warnings like, "Do not pluck carrots after dark, lest they wail and rot." Or, "Avoid stepping on fresh cabbage stalks at dusk, their pain draws mice." Imagine printing that with a serious face. And yet, here you are, in this strange, silent, or not so silent, space. The path curves and you notice a small scarecrow ahead, its straw body slumped like it, too, gave up trying to explain the eggplants. You kneel near a cluster of herbs. Sage, thyme, oregano. They're silent, at least. Or are they plotting? One thing's clear, the line between sound and meaning was thinner then. The squeak of a shoe, the crackle of frost, the groan of a branch, any could be a message from nature. And vegetables. They were nature's tenderest flesh. If animals could scream when killed, why not lettuce when torn? Historians still argue whether this belief came purely from folklore or if it blended with pre-Enlightenment philosophies about natural intelligence. Vitalism, the belief that living organisms are driven by a vital force beyond physical or chemical processes, was still influential. You start to wonder, if everything alive had a force, Could that force make noise? That's the slippery slope 18th century thinkers were on. And it was a wild ride. You pass a low stone bench. Someone has carved a radish into the side. It's smiling. You don't trust it. In a modest village near what's now Slovakia, an entire community reportedly refused to harvest their parsnips for a week one year because of persistent weeping. The weeping, according to their town record, came from the soil around the roots. Was it just wet clay? Maybe. Or was it, as one elderly woman insisted, the plants grieving the harvest of their siblings? This was a time when the line between the mystical and the biological wasn't blurry, it was the same thing. A tomato was red, round, delicious, and possibly full of sadness and secrets. And jokes. Oh, there were jokes. Pamphlets mocked the weeping root crowd, accusing them of being vegetable whisperers with too much cider in their system. But still, those pamphlets existed because people believed. Some authors even debunked the ideas in convoluted ways, like saying it wasn't that vegetables cried, but rather, the air expelled from their wounds may resemble a voice. So helpful. You crouch beside a cabbage. Nothing. Silent. You reach out, very slowly, and touch its outer leaf. It's cool. Smooth. Damp with dew. You pluck one leaf free, snap. The sound echoes too loud. A nearby squirrel darts away. Your heartbeat slows. No words. No moan. But something about the silence feels disappointed. You lean back on your heels, watching the moonlight stripe the garden into long fingers of silver and shadow. It's easy to laugh at those who once believed vegetables could whisper. But here, under this ancient sky, surrounded by living green things and shifting leaves, you start to understand. Maybe it was less about sound and more about the fear that the world, even in its smallest, softest parts, might be watching you back. And just maybe, listening. You move deeper into the garden, your feet brushing past thyme and rosemary that release sleepy puffs of scent into the cool night air. The path curves behind a crumbling wall, and you duck under a hanging lattice of sagging vines. A gnarled sign reads Botanica secreta, barely legible in flaking paint. The perfect place to explore the strange tangle of botanical superstitions that once rooted themselves across 18th century Europe. You squat near a raised bed of leeks. Do they look nervous? Back then, plants weren't just food, they were strange, soft-bodied creatures that grew from the earth without legs or mouths but somehow still participated in the world's moods. People didn't just raise gardens for sustenance. They raised them like pets. Or sometimes like gods. Every plant was a potential omen. The idea that vegetables could communicate didn't sprout in a vacuum. It came from a compost pile of older beliefs, pagan rituals, Galenic medicine, Christian demonology, and the occasional bored nobleman with too much money and not enough daylight. Superstition was the soil, curiosity was the seed. Take Italy, for example. In the early 1700s, several rural communities believed basil would only grow if you cursed while planting it. Sweet basil, made sweeter by swearing at it. And in some Germanic villages, people were told not to look directly at a sprouting onion, lest it reflect their sins and grow twisted. Sounds like a therapy session and a gardening tip. You brush your hand along a row of marigolds, but your ears stay pricked for something subtler. Because belief back then wasn't always loud, it was whispered, passed hand to hand like a recipe. A superstition about cucumbers making humming noises if you planted them near mint. A rule about beets absorbing the last words of the dead if grown beside cemeteries. Historians still argue whether these ideas were meant literally or metaphorically, but that line was blurry to the people who believed them. A metaphor could still burn your toast or your soul if you weren't careful. Some of these beliefs had roots, pun not entirely accidental, in older pagan customs. Celts, Slavs, and pre-Christian Germans all had rich traditions involving plants as spiritual entities. Trees got most of the attention, sure, oaks and ash and elder, but herbs and roots weren't left out. They were just sneakier. A shrieking mandrake was folklore's poster child for the botanical banshee, but quieter vegetables joined the act later. And as Christianity spread, those old beliefs didn't disappear, they just put on new robes. A muttering cabbage? Clearly the devil's trick. An eggplant that shifted shape overnight? Witchcraft. Or, worse, French. You walk past a rusted wheelbarrow, half filled with moldy carrots. They smell faintly like soap and guilt. Something rustles nearby. You don't turn around. One persistent superstition from 18th century Bohemia claimed that rutabagas grown under the light of a waxing moon could converse with spirits. Local farmers apparently avoided moonlit harvesting not out of fear of ghosts, but of being interrupted by their own vegetables holding seance. It's ridiculous, and also just plausible enough to make you check your own shadow. This wasn't just the domain of country folk either. Literate, urban people, those who read newspapers and studied Latin, often still kept little charms in their gardens, just in case. Many households had quiet rituals, sprinkling salt clockwise before digging, whispering a greeting to their squash, even leaving out bread for root spirits during certain harvest festivals. You know, just in case. Even gardening manuals, yes, the scholarly kind, contained odd phrasing that slipped between observation and reverence. One 1721 French guide advised readers to listen to the plant's silence, and cautioned against harvesting rhubarb too early, as it might resent the impatience and rot from spite. Not exactly science, but then again, modern rhubarb is suspicious. Then there's the language itself. People anthropomorphized vegetables constantly. They didn't say a turnip grew, they said it decided to emerge. A lettuce didn't wilt, it mourned the heat. Anthropomorphic? Absolutely. But weirdly charming. And then, there were the whispers. Many claimed that plants, when swaying in windless nights, were speaking to each other. Not rustling, speaking. One Scottish pamphlet from 1735 warned of sorrel sorcery and advised that anyone who heard plants whispering after dusk should flee the garden immediately, lest the green tongues tie your fate to their roots. That's a fancy way of saying don't get possessed by spinach. You step lightly around a patch of bare soil. Some believe you shouldn't walk where carrots have recently been harvested, the roots might still be listening from the earth. Absurd. Completely. And yet, compelling. And don't forget sound itself was a different creature back then. The world wasn't full of engines, radios, alarms. Silence was deeper. No background hum of distant highways. No refrigeration buzz. So when you heard a pop, a creak, or a soft sigh in the vegetable bed, you noticed. Maybe your turnip patch had shifted. Or maybe it was trying to tell you something. It didn't help that science hadn't exactly clarified things yet. The Enlightenment was in bloom, sure, but many scientific explanations still sounded like witchcraft wearing a lab coat. Vitalism, alchemy, and early electrical experiments bled into folklore instead of replacing it. And when a botanist said plants might react to stimuli, the public heard, screaming zucchini. You sit on a low stone wall. Nearby, a young fig tree rustles even though the air is perfectly still. A leaf falls at your feet. There's something oddly comforting in imagining your vegetables have opinions. That your lettuce wants to be picked gently. That your parsley appreciates sunlight. That maybe your kale is judging you, but silently. Until midnight. Superstition was a way to give the natural world a voice. Not because it needed one, but because you did. A way to understand storms, pests, bad yields. Why your prize-winning cucumber suddenly rotted from the inside. The plants were saying something, you just had to listen harder. Maybe even close your eyes. So you do. And in that hush, you almost hear it, a faint rustle, a hesitant murmur. Like a leaf embarrassed to speak up. You open your eyes, but the garden holds its breath. You blink, letting your eyes adjust as the moon slips behind a gauzy cloud. The garden dims, but your ears feel sharper. You take a step and the gravel crunches too loudly underfoot. There's movement near the back fence, a figure, hunched and silent, crouched low beside a row of turnips. You pause. He doesn't notice you. Or pretends not to. You edge closer. His coat is wool, patched at the elbows, dusted in soil. One hand holds a candle stub, the other hovers reverently over the ground. His name is Otto, and he's a gardener. The year is 1762, and Otto believes utterly that his turnips can squeak. He's not alone. Otto writes a letter once a week to his cousin in Leipzig, describing the sounds. Not voices, not words, no one's claiming Shakespearean turnips, but sounds. Whimpers. Small, breathy peeps. Like a drawer opening in the next room, he once wrote. Or the final note of a violin, held too long. He doesn't harvest during full moons anymore. That's when the sounds come strongest. He's convinced they're protests. And his cousin, bless him, believes him too. At least enough to share Otto's letters with other scholars. Soon, others begin to visit. You kneel beside him now. The candlelight flickers across his face. He glances at you, then gestures toward the soil, finger to lips. Wait, he whispers. They always start after midnight. You try not to breathe too loudly. You're not sure whether you want to hear something or not. Historians still argue whether Otto was delusional, poetic, or simply lonely. But his letters were preserved, stuffed into the back of a village archive and rediscovered 2 centuries later. There are 17 of them. And in them, you can track his shift from curiosity to something like obsession. Letter 5 includes this gem. The new ones are quieter. I fear I've bred the voices out. Letter 9 is darker. I heard one gasp today. I didn't touch it. I swear I didn't. Otto wasn't an isolated crank either. His cousin, Albrecht, was a clockmaker and amateur naturalist. He took the letters seriously enough to stage a full acoustic root trial in his own garden, burying flutes and hollow reeds among the vegetables to detect airflow patterns or vibrations. His results? Inconclusive but promising. That phrase alone earned him 2 footnotes in later botanical histories. One particularly fantastic claim comes from letter 12, where Otto describes placing a porcelain bowl near a cluster of young turnips, only to find it cracked the next morning. They broke it, he wrote. Or they needed the space. Was it frost? An animal? Gravity? Sure. Or, maybe root resentment. You can't help but chuckle. The idea of passive-aggressive vegetables suddenly seems more realistic than you're comfortable with. Otto's tiny claim drew attention from a handful of curious minds, some looking to prove, some to disprove, and some just hoping to ride the wave of popular weirdness. One even visited Otto in person, a minor nobleman from Prague with a deep love for peculiar ideas and, reportedly, a soft spot for tubers. This nobleman, Count Ludwig von Dernberg, described his visit in a local periodical. The man listens to turnips as if they are his own kin, he wrote. He treats the soil like a bed, the leaves like sleeping children. I found myself straining my ears despite every instinct. Ludwig didn't hear anything, or at least didn't admit to it in print. But he left with a gift, one of Otto's noisiest turnips, preserved in wax. It remained on the Count's shelf for years, labeled simply, "Do not wake." Some historians believe Otto's case sparked a short-lived fad among amateur botanists in Saxony. There were scattered reports of listening gardens where families would sit outside with horn-shaped devices, placing them near stalks and roots in hopes of catching something, a whisper, a groan, maybe a joke from a philosophical cucumber. And while no one produced definitive audio, the social ripple was real. Markets began selling gentle harvest tools, supposedly designed to minimize plant distress. Not because it made the vegetables tastier, but because nobody wanted a noisy carrot guilt-tripping them during supper. It wasn't just turnips, either. Other reports soon followed: cucumbers that sighed, parsnips that hissed, beets that let out long nasal hums like an old man dreaming. The descriptions became increasingly strange and poetic, which, in hindsight, probably tells you more about the people than the plants. But back to Otto. His final letter ends abruptly. No dramatic farewell, no wild claim, just a simple note. They are quiet now. The cold has returned. I will wait for spring. After that, silence. No one knows what happened to him. The land changed hands. The garden was tilled under. But some say, quietly, that under the right moon, you can still hear a soft whimper rising from the ground, right where Otto once knelt. And there's the thing, whether or not you believe the vegetables made noise, the belief itself was loud. It rippled through communities and salons and supper conversations, sowing just enough doubt to make people reconsider the idea that the natural world might not be completely mute. One fringe philosopher of the time, Emil Grellman, wrote in an obscure tract titled Vegetabilenklang that the root cries not because it suffers, but because it is interrupted. We do not weep at pain, but at the end of song. Was that nonsense? Very likely, but also kind of beautiful. You rise slowly from your crouch beside Otto's imagined candle. The air feels heavier, the sky a little darker. You tread back toward the gravel path, casting one last look over your shoulder at the quiet rows of turnips. They say nothing. But maybe they're just waiting for spring, too. Your shoes scuff through the soft soil, and ahead of you, an ancient wooden door leans half open. On the other side, shelves stacked with cracked leather books, melted candles, and pickled something. You step inside and the air shifts: dust, damp parchment, and a faint tang of something metallic. This is no modern laboratory. It's a relic from a stranger world, where science wasn't entirely separate from sorcery. At the far table, hunched over a pile of scrolls, sits a man with hair like a thundercloud and eyes that have seen too much starlight. You're meeting Paracelsus, Renaissance physician, alchemist, philosopher, and possibly the first person to take the idea of talking vegetables seriously enough to write it down. Yes, that Paracelsus. The one who thought disease came from external spirits and once claimed to cure epilepsy with metallic unicorn powder. He died in the 1500s, true, but his ghost lingered long into the 18th century through his writings. And one particularly spicy passage caught the attention of a later generation. That which grows under moon and rain bears within a spirit, and when struck, yes, even gently, may cry out not in pain but in declaration. Sound vague? That's how Paracelsus always sounded. But Enlightenment thinkers, desperate to thread meaning into the messy tangle of pre-modern philosophy, latched onto it. Cry out. There it was. Proof, maybe, that vegetables weren't just dumb chlorophyll machines, they had presence. Historians still argue whether Paracelsus was being literal, metaphorical, or just trying to impress a girl named Gertrude. But that didn't stop 18th century philosophers from running wild with it. One eccentric disciple, a Swiss mystic named Johann Wörl, gave a lecture titled On the Lettuce's Soul in 1749. You don't want to know how packed that room was. And yet, packed it was. Wörl took Paracelsus's notion and layered on some medieval soul theory, ending up with the idea that every vegetable held a vocal remnant of divine breath. Translation: plants might talk if you bothered to listen. Or if you were worthy. You duck past a stack of drying mandrake roots, they look suspiciously like fingerless toddlers, and find a notebook open on the table. In it, a sketch of a lettuce, large, floppy, and somehow melancholic. Beside it, a list. Sighed when watered. Hummed at sunset. Seemed disappointed. You suppress a snort. Someone really wanted to believe their salad had self-esteem issues. But it wasn't all whimsy. Many early modern thinkers were genuinely obsessed with the idea of pneuma, the breath or spirit of life within matter. And in the strange limbo between medieval mysticism and Enlightenment rationalism, this breath wasn't just metaphorical. It could escape. It could make noise. That's where the idea of vegetable complaint emerged, a theory proposed in 1753 by an Austrian herbalist named Dorothea Lamb. She believed plants made low-frequency noises when handled roughly, which only sensitive souls could hear. She also believed goats were psychic, so, take that with salt. Still, Dorothea conducted experiments. She claimed that by placing young lettuces near dying roses, she could hear a sympathetic moan from the green one as the pink withered. No one else in her salon confirmed it, but someone wrote a poem about it, and that poem went minorly viral for 1760. Of course, not everyone was enchanted. Some scientists attempted to shut the whole theory down, and their frustration bleeds through in surviving documents. One botany professor wrote, "Lettuce does not moan. Carrots do not keen. Peas possess no throat." You can practically feel the vein pulsing in his forehead. And yet, the idea refused to die. You run your hand over a dry vellum page where someone has scribbled the phrase, "Do not eat what has confessed." It's underlined. Twice. The note comes from a fringe religious sect in the Low Countries who believed that plants could admit sin if prayed over. The ones that didn't make noise, fine to stew. The ones that did, they had to be buried. With a sermon. And here's where Paracelsus comes roaring back in. His worldview didn't separate soul from substance. So the idea that a lettuce might whimper, or a beet might groan, that wasn't absurd, it was logical, if uncomfortable. You peer into a glass jar labeled rhubarb tongue, but the contents look more like a melted sock. Still, you admire the dedication. A recurring theme in these older texts is the idea of witnessing. That plants, if not fully conscious, at least remember. And memory, of course, can be stirred into sound. One pamphlet suggested that pulling a plant too harshly releases the echo of its growth. Which honestly sounds like a bad perfume ad, but people bought into it. You reach the end of the room, where a broken lute leans against a half barrel of dried beans. One string remains. You pluck it. It makes a dull, reluctant noise. The beans rustle in response. Coincidence? Sure. But tonight, in this quiet, you can almost hear them plotting their next move. This mingling of Paracelsian soul theory and botanical curiosity produced some of the weirdest footnotes in European science. At least 5 minor texts from the mid-1700s include sidebars warning about over-listening, the idea that humans who spent too much time trying to hear vegetables might begin hallucinating speech. One even blamed a rash of sleeplessness among Parisian scholars on radish dreams. And there were dreams. Recurring ones, documented in letters and diaries, of gardens whispering secrets or accusing their growers. One widow wrote in 1767 that she dreamed her tomatoes told her she'd married the wrong man. Again, probably not a vegetable problem, but it made it into her diary. You return to the garden, stepping out of that strange, crackling archive of thought. The air feels cooler now. Quieter. The lettuce patch nearby looks innocent enough. But as you pass, you hear a soft rustle. A single leaf flutters. You stop. 1 second. 2. No moan. No sigh. But the silence feels smug. You walk along a gravel path flanked by hedges so neatly trimmed they feel more ceremonial than practical, green walls leading to a place of unnatural curiosity. And then, there it is, a palace, elegant and aloof, its windows flickering with candlelight. You're not here for the chandeliers or harpsichord music. You're here for the spinach. That's right. Behind these velvet curtains and powdered wigs, experiments are underway not in chemistry, but in leafy greens. Because when you're a royal board of jewels and opera, what else is there to do but commission trials to see whether spinach can scream? Inside, you find a gilded salon filled with silk furniture and more gossip than air. But past it, through an ornate door, lies something stranger, the royal greenhouse. This isn't a humble potting shed. It's a long hall of warm glass and copper piping, glowing with soft gas lamps and lined with every kind of vegetable imaginable, each carefully labeled and cared for like diplomatic guests. And at the center, the royal plant physiologist, Dr. Augustin Leclerc, a man with a hairpiece like a frightened possum and the dignity of someone who's been asked far too often whether lettuce has lungs. It's 1757, and you've arrived just in time for an evening demonstration. You slip into the shadows as courtiers gather, their laughter turning to hushes. Leclerc clears his throat dramatically. Before him sits a potted spinach plant, surrounded by tuning forks and strange bronze cones. This, he explains, is an apparatus designed to detect minute disturbances in the air when a leaf is pinched. No one laughs. These people have watched bloodletting as performance art. With a flourish, he plucks a leaf. Everyone leans in. Nothing. He tries again, this time with tweezers. A faint flicker in the tuning fork. Gasps. A few take notes. One young lady faints with elegance. Historians still argue whether these results were genuine anomalies or just heat drafts and overexcited imaginations. But the court took it seriously enough to fund Leclerc for another 3 years. Royal courts loved weird ideas. They were status symbols. If your cousin's duchy had a jester, you got a telescope. If they got a telescope, you got a guy who made vegetables cry. It was one-upmanship, but with more compost. And the belief that vegetables could make noise gave the elite the perfect excuse to mix science, theater, and a pinch of existential dread. Think of it, you've conquered territory, survived smallpox, and now you're left wondering if the beet in your soup knows. Some nobles even developed private collections of responsive flora. These weren't magical plants, just ordinary vegetables given poetic reputations. In the garden of Duke Karl Wilhelm of Baden, a special spinach bed was called the orchestra, because it was said to hum when watered at dusk. Gardeners were instructed to use silver watering cans and to apologize, out loud, if they stepped on the mulch. You can't make this up. Well, you can, and they probably did. But the ritual became real because the performance mattered. These rituals offered a sense of control in a world still reeling from plagues, wars, and the terrifying possibility that the earth itself might have feelings. You pass a marble bust of a woman holding a zucchini like a baby. No label. No explanation. Elsewhere in the palace, a lesser-known chamberlain reportedly held séances where the table centerpiece was a roasted pumpkin. Not as a joke. As a medium. The idea was that the pumpkin, having once listened during its growth, could now speak for the soil itself. Most messages were vague, the roots remember, or dig deeper, but people still paid for a seat. Even among royalty, weird beliefs thrived under the surface of enlightenment. Voltaire could pen pages mocking superstition, then still refused to plant parsley near his bedroom. Because, according to a very persistent myth, parsley near sleeping quarters would draw out confessions. From whom? No one knew. But why risk it? You wander through the greenhouse's second wing, past rows of beans, peas, and pale ghostly eggplants. Notes are pinned to some of them, little slips of parchment describing prior episodes. One reads, 13th of May, leaf fluttered violently when candle approached. No breeze. Another, 20th, noticed quiet squeal when uprooted. Repeated test. Heard nothing. Still disturbing. Squeal. Really? Of course, many laughed, quietly, behind fans and in wine-soaked salons. Caricatures began circulating of nobles interrogating vegetables like criminals. One print shows a man shouting at a cabbage while his butler takes dictation. Satire had arrived. Still, there were true believers. Countess Elena von Schönfeld reportedly forbade her household from eating squash entirely after hearing a scream once. She replaced them with potatoes, claiming they were emotionally inert. Her cookbook includes the chilling line, "Best roasted, unlike the ones who cry." You pause, your hand resting on a warm copper railing. The greenhouse creaks softly in the night air. Somewhere, water drips. You listen, but there's only your own breath. And the vegetables. Watching. Always watching. Dr. Leclerc's experiments eventually tapered off. One too many negative results ruined his credibility, and he retired quietly with a pension and a lifetime supply of spinach. The court moved on to other fads like musical glassware and magnetic hats, but echoes of the noisy vegetable craze lingered. And here's the weird part. None of this was seen as totally insane at the time. Eccentric? Sure. Amusing? Absolutely. But unthinkable? Not really. Because even in an age of telescopes and printing presses, the human brain still wanted stories. And what better story than one where your garden can argue back? You step back from the spinach bed, the leaves glistening under oil lamp light. They say nothing. But maybe they're offended you expected them to perform. Royal gardens may be quiet now, but once, they were theaters. And spinach? Well, spinach was the star. You emerge from the glittering absurdity of the royal greenhouse and wander into a different kind of curiosity, one less velvet and powdered wig, more mud-caked boots and bubbling alembics. The air shifts again, from perfumed artifice to damp soil and warm moss. Welcome to the backyards of the Enlightenment. Here, eccentric minds dig for truth with shovels in one hand and wildly incorrect theories in the other. You've entered the world of experimental gardens. And not the charming kind with gnomes. These were real, half-serious laboratories where some of Europe's strangest early scientific minds tested the idea that vegetables could, when poked just right, emit audible sounds. You glance down the row of crude garden beds. Each has a different label. Tension tests, pulled at speed, flame exposure, mild. You really don't want to ask what controlled screaming means. This was a time when science was stretching its limbs, shaking off the sleep of medieval tradition, and sometimes tripping over its own feet. You had brilliant thinkers, yes, but also dilettantes, obsessive tinkerers, and gentlemen naturalists who performed experiments not for rigor, but because they sounded fun over brandy. One such character was Erasmus Gut, a Dutch eccentric who built what he called a vegetable oratorium in 1754. It consisted of a greenhouse, a series of tubes and resonating chambers, and a rotating platform on which he placed vegetables for auditory observation. His most popular claim? That onions, when sliced slowly and methodically, produce a low hum resembling a nun in grief. You can't make this up, and he definitely did. Gut published his findings in a short book titled Lament of the Leaf, Sound Responses in Garden Flora. It included such gems as, the radish, when boiled, offers no defense. But roasted, it sulks. Carrots chirp under pressure, especially when drawn from clay-heavy soil. The cabbage may mutter if tickled. He sold 50 copies. Enough to earn a lecture tour and the scorn of several prominent botanists, who tried and failed to get him banned from the Rotterdam Gardening Society. But Gut wasn't alone. These experimental gardens popped up across the continent. In northern Italy, a trio of amateur scientists developed what they called the cruciferous chamber, a sealed hut where they would subject vegetables, mostly kale, cabbage, and Brussels sprouts, to music, heat, and stress. Their conclusion? Cabbage prefers the flute. Historians still argue whether these experiments were science, satire, or slightly dangerous garden parties. Some were absolutely real, in that they happened. Whether the data meant anything is another matter. You crouch near one particularly chaotic patch labeled sound capture bed. A series of crude brass horns are positioned toward the soil, leading up into a hand-cranked recording device, a kind of early mechanical ear based on organ bellows. It looks like the kind of invention you'd find in a cartoon right before it explodes. You wonder, how desperate were they to hear a beat moan? One fringe group in Bavaria took the idea further. They wore linen hoods to block psychic contamination and harvested only by moonlight. Their central theory? Plants only made noise if they thought they were alone. So the trick was to pretend to leave and then rush back suddenly. You can imagine the results. Mostly silence. Sometimes startled goats. Occasionally sprained ankles. But not every test was completely outlandish. One Parisian botanist, Jules Marot, tried to apply more structured methods. He created a chamber with tightly controlled humidity and airflow, using sensitive paper membranes to detect microvibrations during harvesting. His results? Inconclusive, but suggestive of ambient murmuring. He refused to say more, probably because his funding dried up faster than his lettuce. You reach a crooked wooden sign at the edge of the garden. Beans, do not disturb. You pause. Beyond it, a small enclosed bed has been left wild. No wires, no horns, no clever tubes, just beans, climbing lazily up sticks, glowing faintly silver in the moonlight. A journal entry from an English naturalist named Winifred Cole in 1765 described watching her bin patch sway without wind and hearing a series of gentle tuts, as if scolding me for forgetting the salt. She also noted the beans seemed quieter when she sang. That page is dog-eared in the British archives, presumably by someone trying not to laugh out loud. And yet, the idea that these plants, so still, so green, so ordinary, could respond audibly to the world around them was irresistible. Especially in a time when humans were trying to hear the universe, tuning telescopes, ringing bells in mines, and wiring frogs to batteries. The world was starting to make new sounds. Wasn't it fair to wonder if vegetables had something to say, too? You brush your hand along a low-hanging charred leaf. Nothing. Not even a rustle. But behind you, an old wind-up device coughs to life. A tin disc spins. A crackle of static. Then, a faint squeak. Or a rat. Or just your imagination, filling in the blanks left behind by 200 years of speculative gardening. There were even, briefly, attempts to correlate vegetable sound responses with their taste. A short-lived theory proposed that plants which spoke more when pulled were less bitter, because they had released their emotional tension. This gave rise to a minor cookbook fad titled Cooking with Compassion, which included tips like harvest with soothing tones, and always apologize to herbs before mincing. Did it make the food better? Probably not. But dinner parties got way more interesting. And here's the strangest part. Some ideas from these experimental gardens weren't entirely wrong. Later science would prove that plants do react to stimuli. They send signals. They emit gases. Some even generate measurable electrical responses. But sound? Audible, honest-to-goodness plant noise? That's still up for debate. And so you walk through this twilight garden lab, your footsteps soft on the moss. You pass cracked equipment, curling notepads, and one forlorn sign reading "We heard it once, we swear." And as you leave, you swear the beans, quietly, very quietly, rustle a bit louder than they should. Just enough to make you turn around. Just in case. You cross a low wooden footbridge, the planks creaking beneath you, and step into a strange little clearing. It's circular, too symmetrical to be natural, ringed by squat stone benches and glass jars half buried in the dirt. Here, You've arrived at the oddest outgrowth of the noisy vegetable craze, the acoustic carrot theory. It sounds like a prank. You hope it is. But no, this was real. In 1768, a group of eccentric thinkers in Vienna began whispering a theory so absurd it might have been satire, except they published it. The claim that some carrots, not all, only certain well-bred ones, emitted high-pitched tones as a method of subterranean social alignment. In simpler terms, carrots made sounds to communicate underground. Like root radio. You almost wish this were fiction. It was championed by a peculiar man named Leopold Cram, who, based on portraits, had the eyebrows of a hawk and the eyes of someone who had licked just a little too much mercury. A minor aristocrat with major delusions, Cram believed that carrots produced whistles of purity and could only be properly heard by those of what he called untainted lineage. That's right, he turned carrot whispers into a classist theory. According to Cram's privately printed treatise, Root Harmonies of the Inner Earth, only people of pure breeding could perceive the true sonic emissions of these carrots. He referred to the phenomenon as Die Wurzelstimme, the root voice. You're not sure whether to laugh or call someone. Historians still argue whether Cram was sincere or simply poking fun at Enlightenment-era pseudoscience and inherited nobility. Some claim he was actually mocking purity theories by extending them to vegetables. Others believe he absolutely meant it and tried, unsuccessfully, to breed a carrot choir. Either way, the theory spread. You kneel beside a row of carrots in the clearing. They look innocent, quiet, possibly judgmental. You strain your ears. Nothing. But you know how this works now. You need belief. Or heritage. Or maybe a metal cone aimed just so. Cram's experiment notes still exist, buried in the archives of a forgotten Viennese society whose official motto was, "No sound is too small." His carrots were planted in concentric rings, each labeled with names like Königslied, King's Song, and Rheinwurz, pure root. A small bell was rung at dusk. Then assistants, usually very pale young men with impeccable family trees, were told to record anything they heard. The results? Hilariously vague. Heard tone similar to heated kettle, but nobler. Sound seemed to reject presence of Mr. F. Mr. F being a tailor's son. Note emerged at moonrise, possibly a D-sharp. You begin to suspect the real noise was coming from inside their heads. Still, the acoustic carrot theory gained traction among the fringe elite, particularly those with too much money and a desperate need for intellectual distinction. For a brief, ridiculous window of time, owning whispering carrots became fashionable. One Hungarian baron even hosted silent dinners, where guests were served only carrots grown in his prized soundbed. They were instructed to chew slowly and listen deeply. Reportedly, one woman wept into her napkin, claiming to have heard an ancient lullaby from beneath the soil. Another guest said he heard nothing and was not invited back. You can't help but wonder what dinner conversation was like after that. Back in Germany, a smaller splinter theory emerged, that carrots were tuning themselves to underground mineral deposits. A kind of vegetative echolocation. This theory, while still utterly bananas, or carrots, at least attempted to bridge botany and early geology. One 1771 pamphlet insisted that if a carrot hummed in C minor, it indicated copper below. The pamphlet was withdrawn after someone tried to mine under a monastery garden and ended up in the crypt. No copper. Several skeletons. But not all the reactions were so deluded. A few scholars genuinely wondered if plants might respond to vibration, and began poking at the idea of plant sensitivity to sound. They didn't get far, mostly because they couldn't separate auditory response from wind, temperature, or, frankly, wishful thinking. And yet the carrot idea lingered. Why? Probably because it scratched multiple itches at once. The mystery of nature, the seduction of secret knowledge, and the always reliable ego boost of only I can hear this. If you can convince yourself a vegetable is serenading you, but only you, well, suddenly you're not just a gardener. You're chosen. You reach for a carrot, tug gently. It resists at first, then pops from the ground with a soft thwip. No chorus. No whisper. Just a smear of dirt and the mild, earthy smell of potential stew. Still, the idea stuck around long enough to inspire one early music theorist to write a short score for string quartet titled Voices of the Rooted. It was never performed publicly, but a surviving copy includes stage directions like, "Violinist should imagine he is a vegetable, and pause here as if hearing from below." You can't make this up. But they did. Or maybe they believed it. Even Cram's death was surrounded by strange rumors. Some said he was buried with his best carrots, in hopes they would whisper him through the veil. Others say his last words were, "Can you hear them? They're harmonizing now." Whether he was mad, mocking, or both, Cram left behind a legacy of gentle absurdity. One that proves how easily science and status get tangled in the garden hose of human imagination. You walk away from the carrot ring, ears ringing slightly, not with sound, but with the strange echo of a time when even the humblest vegetable might be humming back. You step out of the carrot ring and straight into a darker mood. The wind changes again, subtly, like someone blowing softly on your neck. The soil underfoot grows heavy, almost metallic, and the trees that surround you lean in just a little too much. You've wandered into the shadowy fringes of the noisy vegetable movement, the part where things get superstitious. Because for some in 18th century Europe, noisy vegetables weren't just scientific oddities or party jokes. They were omens. Welcome to the era of the whispering harvest. In rural villages scattered across Eastern Europe, places where folklore was still stronger than fact, stories began to circulate that certain vegetables made sounds not as a reaction to stimuli, but as warnings. If your parsnips whined in the field, bad luck. If your pumpkins groaned at night, someone in your family was about to die. And if your turnips screamed, you definitely didn't want to find out. One widely copied pamphlet from 1772 titled Of Roots and Rumors catalogued several cases of agricultural unrest. Most were collected from isolated farmers, often relayed through traveling monks or nosy apothecaries. They weren't framed as jokes. They were framed as testimonies. One farmer in Transylvania, yes, really, swore his cabbage patch began to make a groaning like wood under pressure 2 nights before his barn burned down. Another in Moravia claimed his beets gave off sharp, rhythmic clicks on the night his cow died of bloating. He called it the tick of the tuber. You'd laugh if he hadn't etched it on his wife's gravestone. Historians still argue whether these stories were sincere folklore, exaggeration, or just deeply rooted anxiety about nature's unpredictability. Life was hard. Crops failed. People got sick for no clear reason. If your livelihood came from the soil, and the soil began making noise, you'd listen. The superstitions grew legs. By 1775, small charms began appearing in regional markets, little brass ears and root-shaped talismans designed to deafen the ground or block unwanted murmurings. One folk healer recommended burying a copper spoon upside down to turn the whispers back upon themselves. You don't know what that means, but you're tempted to try it anyway. In Poland, a short-lived belief took hold that rutabagas could carry curses. The reasoning? They grew silently until harvest, then allegedly squeaked as they were plucked. A sound described as like a mouse falling into a well. Peasants began slicing their rutabagas early, just to be sure they weren't building up something. Imagine living in fear of an emotional root vegetable. You pass a broken stone marker, half buried in moss. Scratched faintly into its surface are the words, "Enai suchai korzenia," do not listen to the root. But the fears weren't just rural. In certain court circles, too, vegetables began acquiring reputations. Queen Maria Theresa of Austria once banned a shipment of white asparagus after one of her cooks reported a hissing sound while trimming it. The asparagus was incinerated. The cook promoted, oddly enough. Turns out you get noticed when you save the empress from a potential vegetable uprising. And then there's the case of the singing lettuce of Sibiu. In 1781, a noble family in Transylvania claimed that a specific batch of lettuce in their private garden emitted an eerie harmony when touched by moonlight. The family claimed to have brought in a priest, a string quartet, and a botanist. The priest declared it demonic. The quartet said it was not in tune. The botanist quietly excused himself and never returned. Within a month, the family moved. The garden was paved. The lettuce, presumably, silenced. There are dozens of little stories like these, whispered at the edges of proper history. You won't find them in major textbooks, but they show up in odd places, margins of almanacs, letters from traveling scholars, sermons laced with agricultural warnings. The deeper you go, the more surreal it gets. One particularly odd belief held that if you fed a parsnip blood, yes, fed, it would develop a voice over time. Usually described as raspy. There's no recorded case of this working, but also, no recorded case of anyone trying it more than once. Small blessings. Another tale from southern Germany involved a monk who claimed to have grown a confessional potato. He said that when held to the ear, the potato whispered sins, sometimes not even yours. He was eventually transferred to a quieter monastery. One assumes without potatoes. As you walk deeper through this eerie stretch of imagined history, you pass rows of darkened crops, each marked with small hanging bells. A recreation of an 18th century protection ritual. The bells weren't meant to ward off spirits, but to mask plant noises. That way, no one heard anything unsettling by accident. One journal from 1778 recommends setting a rooster nearby to absorb the first whisper, since animals were less likely to die of fright. You glance around. No roosters in sight. Just you, some old soil, and the faintest hum of wind. It's easy to laugh at these stories now. But remember, these people didn't have our tools, our sensors, our science. What they had was instinct, fear, and the unsettling sense that nature was bigger than them. Which it is. So when your pumpkins started humming at midnight, you didn't ask, is this measurable? You asked, what does it want? Still, not everyone bought in. Some Enlightenment thinkers tried to squash these superstitions, calling them vegetable hysteria. A French pamphlet from 1782 even dismissed the idea of whispering vegetables as the desperate sound of an uneducated hoe. It sold poorly. Yet even the skeptics admitted one thing: people were hearing something. Whether it was the squeak of boots in damp soil, the shriek of cold wind through brittle stalks, or just the creak of your own nerves fraying from hunger and isolation, noise came from the garden. And in the dark, you couldn't always be sure it was just the wind. You step carefully through the last edge of the forest, the trees falling away behind you like a thick curtain parting. The air feels cooler here, thinner, tinged with something clinical. The strange superstitions you just passed are still echoing faintly in your ears, but now the tone shifts. This next chapter in your journey is where the wigged and powdered minds of Enlightenment Europe decided to get experimental. You've entered the laboratory. Welcome to the curious case of sonic botany. This was the moment when the noisy vegetable craze collided head-on with the growing culture of scientific inquiry. The salons were buzzing. The coffee houses were roaring. And in a few particularly strange backrooms, philosophers were wiring up radishes. In 1783, the Royal Society of London, yes, the very one that gave us Newton and Boyle, received a letter from a German naturalist named Dr. Albrecht Meiss. He claimed to have successfully documented rhythmic sound emissions from legumes under stress. The title of his paper, Pulses in Pulses. He wrote, When placed in a vacuum bell and gently prodded, the bin emits a dull pop as though sighing. You hope he meant metaphorically. But knowing this crowd? Probably not. Historians still argue whether mice was serious or just trolling the Royal Society for fun. His diagrams were suspiciously cute, one pea with what looked like a musical note floating above it. But the Society filed the letter nonetheless. They even discussed it for 7 whole minutes, according to the minutes. Encouraged by the attention, Mice went further. He began attaching rudimentary stethoscopes to cucumbers. His assistant, an unlucky lad named Friedrich, reported hearing tickings and low squelches, which mice interpreted as a primitive language of pressure and time. Friedrich later became a librarian, probably for the silence. Meanwhile, in France, an upstart group of experimental agrophonists, try saying that 5 times fast, began hosting public demonstrations where vegetables were placed on vibrating tables and observed for motion. A popular trick involved placing a cabbage on a wooden surface and playing a violin beside it. If the leaves rustled, the audience gasped. One particularly dramatic performer, Jules Renaud, claimed he could elicit a wail from a melon using a tuning fork and the right incantation. No recordings survive, thankfully, but he drew big crowds. His final show, The Gourd That Wept, ended in disaster when the melon exploded mid-performance. Too much tuning. Not enough melon. You pass through a room recreated in meticulous detail, pale green walls, shelves stacked with ear trumpets, and a faint smell of chalk and radish water. This is a model of Mice's own workspace, complete with the famous listening chair, a wooden seat with a hole bored into it and a funnel aimed at a potted turnip. Yes. Someone sat here and waited for a root vegetable to speak. And they weren't alone. Across Europe, a minor arms race began to develop. Gentlemen scholars and bored nobles alike competed to build the most sensitive vegetable audio apparatus. One featured a mesh-covered dome where you could place your head and listen without atmospheric interference. Another had a series of brass tubes that curved down into a beat patch, like the world's saddest pipe organ. They called these devices phytophones. You call them a red flag. One French inventor insisted he'd crafted a way to convert letters' sounds into notes, which he arranged into a short minuet. He even tried to have it performed at Versailles. Reportedly, Queen Marie Antoinette was not amused. She said it sounded like forks dropped onto velvet. Which, to be fair, sounds delightful but not musical. Still, it wasn't all nonsense. Some early observations, hidden among the eccentricity, hinted at something real. People noticed that plants did respond to vibration. That different sounds affected growth. One experiment placed peas beside different bell chimes and tracked which ones bent more quickly toward light. The results weren't exactly rigorous, but they were curious. A few naturalists began writing cautiously about stimulus thresholds in flora, arguing that perhaps some faint awareness existed in plant life. That maybe, just maybe, these noises weren't the plants speaking, but reacting. The line between curiosity and obsession, however, grew thin. In 1786, a man named Reverend Thomas Vell wrote a long treatise titled Divine Sound in the Garden, in which he argued that the Garden of Eden had echoed with the soft utterances of God's vegetables. He went on to suggest that cabbages lost their voices after the fall of man. You get the sense that theology might have been mixed with too much port. But even the skeptics found themselves caught up in the wave. A Dutch academic named Cornelius van Dijk tried to debunk the whole phenomenon by growing identical vegetables in complete silence and total noise. He placed one bed beside a blacksmith's forge, the other in a padded, soundproof room. The noisy vegetables, stunted and bitter. The quiet ones, crisp and plump. Van Dijk concluded that, whether they produce sound or not, vegetables dislike sound. Perhaps they value privacy. A thoughtful observation, if a bit anthropomorphic. Of course, no true scientific fad is complete without a bit of commerce. Soon, special silent gardening gloves were being marketed to the gentry, made of soft lambskin and designed to pluck without distress. One gardener claimed his tomatoes produced fewer stress gasps when handled gently. Another insisted his leeks sighed in relief when laid on velvet. You stop beside a velvet-lined basket in a display case. There's a note attached, for use with highly sensitive gourds. You don't know whether to laugh or whisper an apology to the squash. Through it all, the idea persisted, that vegetables might be more than passive green blobs. That somewhere beneath their skins, they might register the world. Maybe not like us. Maybe not at all. But enough to make a sound. Enough to matter. And so, in labs both real and ridiculous, 18th century Europe kept listening. Not always wisely. Not always soberly. But listening nonetheless. The smell of waxed floors fades behind you as the world shifts again. Your feet now find cobblestones uneven and rain-slick, though no rain falls. Lanterns flicker on rusted posts. A fog curls in from nowhere, muffling the edges of buildings that feel slightly too narrow, slightly too tall. You've wandered into the cities now, London, Paris, Vienna, where urban imagination took hold of the noisy vegetable myth and made it something else entirely. This was the age of hoaxes and high society pranks. You hear the faint tinkle of piano keys through an upstairs window, something baroque, a little off-tempo. And underneath it, a soft popping, like kernels in a pan. But you're not in a kitchen. You're in a drawing room, where powdered wigs meet theatrical mischief. It began, as these things often do, with boredom. In 1784, a fashionable salon in Paris hosted an event billed as La Soirée des Plantes Sensibles, an evening dedicated to sensitive flora. Attendees included poets, philosophers, one disgruntled apothecary, and a bored duchess. The feature event. A performance in which various vegetables, wired to invisible threads, were made to speak in response to poetry. A carrot sighed when asked about love. A cabbage groaned at the word war. An onion broke into sobs on cue. Everyone applauded. No one questioned it. Until the next morning, when a guest wrote in his diary, "I saw the strings. It was absurd. But for one moment, I wanted the turnip to feel despair." That's the trick, isn't it? Even when we know it's fake, we sometimes wish it were real. The hoaxes caught on quickly. Across Europe, actors and showmen developed routines around vegetable ventriloquism. A popular London duo, the Oaken Twins, performed a sketch called The Rhubarb Recites, wherein a stalk of rhubarb, held dramatically in a gloved hand, would whisper historical insults in a thick Cockney accent. "Oi, Cromwell, you soupy Burke," it once squeaked. Roaring laughter every time. Of course, not everyone was amused. The Royal Horticultural Society issued a statement condemning the theatrical manipulation of perfectly innocent plants. Meanwhile, the Times ran a short-lived advice column in 1786 warning young ladies not to fall under the spell of botanical sorcery, lest your suitors sprout fibrous affections. A Scottish inventor, always 3 steps too far, claimed he had created the world's first vegetable gramophone. It was just a hollowed squash with a voice funnel jammed in. When questioned about its authenticity, he shouted, "I said it was a Gordian speaker," and vanished into a pub. He was never seen again. Hoaxes were one thing, but in the cities, the myth started to spill into belief. Small children were told bedtime tales about carrots that tattled. In one London borough, a baker claimed his sourdough failed because his potatoes screamed betrayal after he used onions from a rival shop. He switched back. The bread improved. Coincidence? Or a victory for vegetable loyalty? Historians still argue whether these city stories were urban legend, ironic performance art, or the subconscious outlet of a population rapidly losing touch with its food sources. See, by the late 18th century, city dwellers didn't grow their own vegetables anymore. They bought them, washed, chopped, and neatly arranged in baskets, far removed from their dirty, noisy origins in the fields. That distance made them easier to imagine. Vegetables in the city weren't food. They were props. And that led to stranger territory. In Prague, a group of amateur dramatists hosted a secret society called Les Légumes Parlants, the Talking Vegetables. They met weekly to commune with sentient produce, often while quite drunk. One member, Franz L., wrote in his memoir that he once spent 42 minutes whispering insecurities to a fennel bulb before it answered back, though I now realize it was my reflection in a wine bottle. Another group in Berlin took it further. They staged a mock trial, the People versus the cauliflower. The accusation? Being too smug. The defense was weak. The sentence, beheading, followed by a vinaigrette dressing. Tickets sold out. Back in Paris, a pamphlet began circulating, Les Soupirs des Légumes, the size of vegetables. It contained fake interviews with carrots, We Hate the Word Crunch, satirical essays by Leeks, and one absolutely deranged love letter supposedly penned by a beetroot named Gaston. He wrote, "I bleed for you, darling." Quite literally. And yet, not all of this was satire. In some city corners, pseudoscientific cults cropped up. One group, calling themselves the Order of the Green Voice, believed that vegetables were minor angels, punished to grow silently in dirt for humanity's sins. They dressed in moss robes and practiced silent sowing, planting seeds with closed eyes and sealed lips. Their motto? Let the soil speak for itself. No one really took them seriously, except for one Viennese priest who briefly joined before realizing they didn't allow garlic in their rituals. That was a deal breaker. And here you are now, walking past rows of mock produce carts, soft yellow lamps casting shadows on oddly expressive turnips. A cabbage head wears a monocle. A rutabaga sports a tiny bowler hat. This is a staged marketplace, a loving recreation of La Marche de Murmurs, a fictional setting from an 18th century play in which every vegetable on sale has a scandalous secret. The play flopped, by the way. Apparently, people weren't ready for a romantic subplot between a tomato and a celery stick. Too soon. But these urban hijinks, these over-the-top pranks, plays, and pamphlets did one thing very well. They kept the idea alive. They gave it legs. They made it less about actual noise, and more about what we project onto nature. How easily we anthropomorphize. How readily we believe that even a silent cabbage might, if pushed, have something to say. Because deep down, maybe you don't really want the vegetables to talk. You just want them to listen. The fog lifts. Your steps feel lighter now, and the cityscape fades behind you like a half-remembered dream. You wander through what looks like a park, but bigger, older, curated not for leisure but for wonder. Trimmed hedges, gravel paths, and marble statues with wild expressions all line the garden of a vast 18th century botanical institute. And it is here, in this lush realm of ivy-covered conservatories and men with tweed obsessions, that the noisy vegetable myth takes a scholarly turn. Welcome to the age of classification. The Enlightenment loved putting things in boxes. Linnaeus was out there naming plants like a kid labeling lunch containers. Every naturalist had their own system, kingdoms, phyla, 1,000 Latin syllables all tumbling over each other in the name of order. And into this chaos waddled the idea, what if vegetables weren't just biological specimens, but expressive ones? This was the intellectual's version of believing vegetables made noise, not because they screamed, but because they might communicate. Botanically, behaviorally, emotionally, quietly, but meaningfully. You pass under a glass archway into a recreation of Linnaeus's own greenhouse. Warm humidity curls your hair. Lush ferns stretch toward the ceiling. A waxy placard on the wall reads, "If plants do not speak, they gesture." Linnaeus, possibly apocryphal. Historians still argue whether he said that. There's no direct record. But his notes on Mimosa pudica, the sensitive plant, show his deep fascination with flora that reacts to touch, light, even time. That plant, in particular, folds its leaves when you touch it. Slowly. Dramatically. Like a shy aristocrat offended by a rude comment. It became the poster child of plant behavior. If a leaf could move in response to the world, who's to say it couldn't also whisper? Soon, other botanists followed the thread. In Vienna, scholars began mapping plant movement on circular charts, tracking daily rotations, petal shifts, and subtle vibrations in stems. They called it chronobotany, and while the name didn't catch on, the idea did. They argued that vegetables might not speak, but they kept time. That growth itself could be a kind of language. But then came Dr. Bernhard Elias of Amsterdam. He didn't care for poetic metaphors. He wanted evidence. He published a treatise in 1791 titled Mechanisms of Plant Motion and Possible Auditory Output, a thrilling read, if you're into dense German and aggressive footnotes. He claimed that during certain stages of growth, some vegetables produced microfrequencies, detectable only through sensitive wooden instruments, essentially pre-modern acoustic amplifiers. He called them flora sounds. He said he had heard them. Others weren't so sure. A respected colleague called his device an expensive kazoo with ivy on it. Still, Elias's ideas planted seeds, too easy, in the minds of other naturalists. They started examining their vegetables differently. Not just for shape, color, or flavor, but for signs of interaction. One fascinating fringe tidbit. A British gardener, Harriet Mallow, kept detailed journals of her morning conversations with her celery. She wrote, "When I hum a tune, it seems to sway more. I believe it likes Handel." Her family said she was eccentric. But her celery was famously vibrant. This is the point in the garden where things blur, where hard science bleeds into soft suggestion. You walk past a desk scattered with quills, ink stains, and open scrolls. One bears a delicate ink drawing, a cross-section of a beet with a spiraling interior pattern labeled possible sound chambers, in cursive. Another diagram shows a turnip with 3 tiny holes drilled into its side, leading to a long copper tube. A note reads, "No sound. Only smell." That experiment did not go well. But the real shift came when philosophers got involved. Immanuel Kant, yes, that Kant once mused in a letter that plants might possess a silent will toward the sun, implying something close to awareness. Now, did he mean that literally? Probably not. But his followers wanted to believe he did. Suddenly, noisy vegetables weren't just a curiosity, they were an idea. A metaphor. A symbol of the limits of human knowledge. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, famously obsessed with botany, even wrote, "Were the cabbage to speak, it would likely denounce man as both gardener and tyrant." A classic Rousseau move, politicize the cabbage. Soon, treatises began springing up with deeply serious titles. The expressive bean, legume as living subject. On the mutable stillness of the parsnip. Vegetal silence and the problem of listening. They weren't kidding. You find a velvet-covered lectern with a book open to a passage. Let us consider the vegetable not as silent, but as unheard. The fault lies not in their muteness, but in our deafness. Heavy stuff, huh? Especially when you're staring at a table of root vegetables beside it, lined up like a jury. But that's where Enlightenment thinking took the idea. Beyond laughter, beyond fear, into a new kind of wonder. What if plants had stories? Not myths or fairy tales, but timelines, reactions, even emotions we couldn't yet interpret. Of course, they didn't have the tools to prove any of it. just telescopes pointed inward. Theories sprouting from hopeful minds. Some mocked the trend, calling it intellectual gardening. Others joined in earnest. A few turned the idea into spiritual philosophy, arguing that plants held divine messages we'd ignored for centuries. One letter from a German scholar suggested that perhaps the fall of man wasn't when we ate the apple, but when we stopped hearing the apple tree. That's heavy, especially for bedtime. And yet, you can't help but feel something here walking this corridor of leafy reverence. The way the vines creep along the stone. The way sunlight filters through the greenhouse glass. You begin to wonder if all this noise about noise was just humanity's way of trying to listen to something it forgot how to hear. A long sigh of wind curls through the leaves overhead. A pea pod rattles softly, and you keep walking. A faint click, like the unlatching of a window, resets the air around you. Gone are the dusty scrolls and humid greenhouses. You're somewhere cleaner now, sharper white walls, brass instruments, and the quiet hum of curiosity dressed in lab coats. You've crossed into the final decades of the 18th century, the very edge of what most would call the modern scientific era. And here's where things get strangely rigorous. It's the rise of experimental botany and the moment when a few brave researchers decided to stop asking if vegetables were noisy metaphorically, and instead ask, can we actually measure it? Yes. They really tried. The room you're in resembles a physics lab. On one table, an array of copper cones, string pulleys, and wax-sealed jars labeled radish, disturbed, cucumber, unaware, and ominously, beet, agitated. Welcome to the sound experiments. The star of this section, one Jacques-Henri Laframboise, a Swiss-born natural philosopher turned botanical acoustics enthusiast. In 1797, he published the slim but deeply earnest volume titled Observations on Audible Vegetable Emissions During Physical Stress. It did not sell well. His theory, that plants, particularly root vegetables, emit microauditory distress signals when cut, bruised, or exposed to sudden changes in temperature. He believed these weren't just chemical reactions, but sound events, perceptible to the correct instruments. His prototype, a massive brass horn connected to a carved-out pumpkin. You're not even kidding yourself anymore. It looks like a pirate telescope jammed into a squash. But Laframboise insisted it worked. When struck lightly, he wrote, the potato produces a noise not unlike the muttering of a tired child. That exact line was mocked in a Parisian comedy for months. But behind the ridicule, Laframboise tapped into something that still echoes today. Historians still argue whether his methods had any merit or whether he was just hearing room echo and wishful thinking. But he wasn't alone. An Italian priest-scientist named Father Giancarlo Morelli attempted to train basil plants to react to specific tones. He'd ring a bell before watering them, theorizing that they would eventually grow toward the bell even without water. Spoiler, they didn't. But his parishioners swore the basil was more fragrant when Mozart played. Placebo? Maybe. Or maybe plants have better taste in music than we do. Then there was Lucretia Dobbins, a British botanist whose whisper garden featured acoustically sensitive chambers where she'd recite poetry to radishes. Her hypothesis? Words affected growth patterns. Her radishes were mediocre, but the poetry was solid. Her most famous line, "Oh, ruby root, may thy flesh split sweet." A fringe theory caught traction here too, that cutting vegetables under different moon phases produced different sound releases, audible pops, tiny sighs, or what one researcher called a high-pitched whimper. Most of these findings were anecdotal, suspiciously poetic, or outright hallucinated. But they filled journals nonetheless. You stroll past a display case. Inside, a velvet pillow holds the infamous brass rubophone, a ludicrous contraption designed to amplify the theoretical scream of a freshly cut rhubarb stalk. It never worked. At least, Not in any way you'd hope. But the inventor, a Belgian named Clement, claimed he once heard it say no during a thunderstorm. Did it? Probably not. But here's what did happen. By 1799, the Royal Society in London felt compelled to issue a formal address on the limits of botanical sensation. A 64-page report calmly and somewhat passive-aggressively reminded researchers that plants lacked vocal cords, ears, or brains, and that beyond metaphor and spiritual fancy, no cabbage has been shown to scream. That kind of ruined the fun. Suddenly, grants dried up. The Vegetal Acoustics Quarterly stopped publishing. A group known as the Whispering Root Circle dissolved, reportedly after one member was caught secretly blowing air through parsnip hollows to fake sighs. But the idea didn't die. It just went underground. In the salons of Paris and the foggy lecture halls of Edinburgh, people whispered about the last noise. A theorized moment still unproven when a plant, under just the right pressure, at the perfect ripeness, would produce a sound. Not a scream. Not a word. Just something. Call it the ghost in the garden. You step through another door into a cooler, darker room. Here, no grand theories. Just shelves of notebooks, thousands of pages detailing failed experiments, wild hopes, impossible claims. Margins filled with question marks and tired scribbles like maybe squash more expressive than expected. A torn paper catches your eye. Day 87, cut leak. Silence again. Felt, judged. The spirit of this whole movement wasn't failure, it was longing. A wish to hear what we couldn't. To break the wall between flora and fauna. Because if even a turnip could cry out, then maybe the world was more alive than we gave it credit for. Here's the quirky fringe tidbit to end on. One pamphlet, Vegetable Memory and the Whispering Vine, claimed that certain squashes held ancestral knowledge if you tapped them rhythmically. The recommended beat. 3 soft taps, followed by a long pause, then one final tap while chanting, "Speak now, ye ancient marrow." It didn't work. But man, wouldn't it be cooler if it did? And maybe that's the heart of it. All these experiments, these odd contraptions and moonlit whispers, none ever produced a verifiable scream. Not one audible plea for mercy. But they reflected something else entirely, our hunger for connection. For understanding. Even with something as silent as a beat. So you walk on, past the failed horns and hopeful notebooks, through a corridor humming with the soft rustle of unseen leaves. And just as you exit the lab, you hear it, so faint you almost miss it, a tiny pop. Could be a settling pipe. Could be a carrot. You'll never know. The corridor behind you fades into darkness, and ahead, a warm glow draws you forward. Not torchlight. Not candlelight. Something richer, golden, like lamplight on polished mahogany. You step into a drawing room mid-18th century style, elegant but not ostentatious. A globe in the corner, a fireplace flickering, shelves of books behind curved glass. And there, reclining with a glass of something amber and dramatically aromatic, is the Enlightenment's favorite paradox, the gentleman mystic. Because just as science was trying to box the noisy vegetable myth into extinction, mysticism was lovingly carving it into marble. This is where things get strange again. Because vegetables weren't just subjects of laboratories and gardens. They were slipping into seances, rituals, and metaphysical poetry. Welcome to the occult vegetable revival. In this cozy, velvet-upholstered space, you meet characters like Jonathan Beecham, a soft-spoken English occultist who believed certain vegetables were ethereal conductors. According to his treatise on verdant sensibilities, carrots, onions, and cabbages acted as earthly mirrors to celestial vibrations. It was the beginning of what some historians call botanomancy, the belief that vegetables could not only respond to divine forces, but channel them. Beecham's most famous experiment involved placing a red cabbage in the center of a chalk-drawn sigil and reciting psalms backward. The goal? To make the cabbage speak in tongues. What actually happened? The cabbage wilted. Beecham swore it whispered a secret name before collapsing. His assistant said it sounded more like gas escaping. Potato, potato. Still, the idea caught on. In salons across Europe, spiritualists began incorporating vegetables into divination rituals. A boiled artichoke at the center of a table. A single leek tied with red thread. And the most beloved item of all, the divining gourd. Round, ridged, and hollow, it was believed to sing during trances, though skeptics insisted it was just wind. Historians still argue whether any of these rituals were taken seriously or merely theatrical novelties meant to amuse bored aristocrats. But by 1800, vegetable séances were real enough to earn both popularity and ridicule. One London pamphlet titled The Green Oracle outlined how to consult the turnip for love, including which questions to ask, does he adore me, how to phrase them, and what kind of candle to light. Spoiler: beeswax. Always beeswax. You move toward a writing desk, where quills lie beside stained parchment. A scrawled note reads, "The beet knows, but says nothing." Of course it doesn't. But people wanted it to. That's the thread that never snapped, this persistent, irrational hope that somewhere in the vegetable kingdom, there was meaning. Pattern. Maybe even a voice. This era gave birth to plant clairvoyants, self-proclaimed listeners who claimed they could hear the spiritual murmurs of growing things. One notable example, Madame Fioretta La Plume, who toured France whispering to potatoes on stage. Her claim? That tubers could reveal truths about death, betrayal, and misplaced heirlooms. She wore a velvet cloak and always had a shallot in her sleeve. Naturally. She was eventually arrested for fraud, but not before selling out a 6-month engagement in Lyon. Meanwhile, secret societies joined the party. A splinter sect of the Rosicrucians reportedly performed rites involving boiled celery tied with ribbons, chanting about the eternal leaf. Their doctrine, though confusing, insisted vegetables absorbed psychic trauma from human touch. So, naturally, you weren't supposed to chop onions when upset. Actually, there might be something to that one. Among the most bizarre accounts, an anonymous diary from 1799 detailing a midnight gathering in Prague where initiates placed kale leaves on their tongues and chanted phrases to summon the garden spirit. Supposedly, the spirit responded by turning a row of carrots bright red. Others present claimed nothing happened, and the carrots were just carrots. But these events, half ritual, half performance, speak to something larger. How deeply people wanted vegetables to be more than food. More than nutrition or agriculture. They wanted mystery, magic, meaning. So vegetables became symbols. The onion, layers of hidden truth. The parsnip, inner clarity. The cabbage, oh, the cabbage, always the cabbage, stood for endurance, stubbornness, and buried wisdom. Not bad for something you boil to death on Sundays. You sit briefly in an armchair as imagined voices flutter around you, echoes of old rituals. Gentle laughter. Low chanting. Someone arguing about beat alignment. It's absurd, yes. But also strangely touching. One fringe tidbit that makes you pause. In a letter dated 1801, a noblewoman claimed her gardener was struck by lightning while harvesting peas and afterward swore he could feel the vegetables listening. He refused to work with potatoes again, calling them too judgmental. Of course, no scholarly record confirms this. But the anecdote took on a life of its own, retold in whispers at tea tables and smoky taverns. The idea that vegetables could remember something, could feel something. Some of these beliefs quietly trickled into early Romantic poetry. A line from a little-known Wordsworth draft reads, The turnip lifts its gaze at dawn and sighs for roots once severed. His editor wisely removed it. But it's a gem. By now, you begin to see the pattern. Every century, someone rediscovers the myth, reinvents it, repackages it. Whether in a lab, a garden, or a candlelit parlor, the noisy vegetable never dies. It just changes voices. You stand, once again surrounded by quiet. A lace curtain flutters. The golden lamplight dims to amber. And you sense that this room, like many others, was never truly about the vegetables. It was about us. Our need to project life where there is stillness. Emotion where there is instinct. A whisper where there is growth. And so, even in this strange, velvet-hung corner of European mysticism, vegetables were made to sing, even if only in our minds. You reach for the doorknob. It's cool, brass, and shaped like a sprouting radish. Of course it is. The door creaks open with a sound like a tired drawer sliding shut, and you find yourself in what can only be described as a museum lobby abandoned by time. Stone columns. Iron sconces. A single ticket booth unattended for 2 centuries. But scattered on pedestals, framed behind dusty glass and roped off in velvet cords, are the relics, artifacts of belief, folly, and fascination. This is the quiet aftermath of a centuries-long conversation with vegetables. And it's time for the skeptics to take the stage. Because while mystics were whispering to onions and inventors were funneling rhubarb gas through brass tubes, there was another camp building momentum, the cold, flinty-eyed rationalists. These were the thinkers who looked at a screaming cabbage theory and said, "Let's all calm down." By the early 1800s, Europe was tilting hard toward mechanistic science, rational thought, observable data, repeatable experiments. The age of reason was having its long overdue moment, and the age of noisy vegetables? Well, it was being laughed out of courtrooms and coffee houses alike. You wander past an enormous painting, a caricature from 1803. A beat in a powdered wig screams on a courtroom bench while a potato in spectacles cross-examines it. The caption reads, "The defendant reeks of root bias." You'd laugh if it weren't all so precise. This is when botanical science began to assert itself more aggressively. The French naturalist Antoine Lavoisier, yes, the chemist, publicly dismissed auditory reactions in plants as delicate fantasies of poets and garden romantics. He proposed, instead, that all vegetable responses could be explained through measurable chemical changes. It was not the scream of a plant, it was the hiss of escaping gas. Historians still argue whether this total dismissal threw out a few good ideas along with the ridiculous ones, but the tide had turned. Universities stopped entertaining the fringe. No more grants for whisper experiments. No more seances with artichokes. From this point forward, vegetables were plants. Period. And yet, some skeptics got weird, too. Take Professor Ernst Wiegand, a botanist in Leipzig, who went out of his way to debunk every noisy vegetable claim he encountered. He even hosted public debunking dinners, where guests watched as he deliberately mistreated vegetables, boiled beets at odd hours, stabbed eggplants with thermometers, yelled at lettuce, and then noted, "See? No sound." But here's the quirky part. Despite claiming total disbelief, Wiegand kept meticulous sound journals, just in case. One entry reads, "Cabbage number 12 released sudden hiss. Gas pocket. Unclear. Do not publish." Why did he keep them? Maybe curiosity. Maybe hope. One corner of the museum displays instruments used by skeptics, forceps, tuning forks, brass weight scales. But mixed in are stranger tools, a stethoscope mounted on a turnip, a vegetable megaphone carved from cherrywood, a black box labeled "Beat Witness, do not open." So even the skeptics were kind of dabbling. The cultural tide, meanwhile, kept shifting. By 1815, Literary salons had replaced vegetable séances with lectures on moral philosophy. Spiritualists moved on to table rapping and mirror gazing. And the poor cabbage. It went back to soup duty. But some thinkers couldn't let go entirely. The philosopher Jean-Marie Roland wrote in 1820 that belief in plant voices was a mirror of our own fear that the world is alive in ways we cannot see, and that we are deaf to its language. He added, "If carrots weep, what else have we failed to hear?" Roland, notably, also believed in haunted furniture, so, grain of salt. Still, that fear of missing something vital, of ignoring the murmur of the world, stayed embedded in the public imagination. You pass a bookshelf labeled vegetables that should have spoken but didn't. Inside, satire, confessions, and one heartbreakingly sincere memoir titled The Silent Parsnip. A man named Elias Hoft claimed to have raised a parsnip from seed, whispered to it daily, and buried it ceremonially when it failed to speak on its harvest day. "She never made a sound," he wrote. "But I think she understood." You step into a smaller alcove, where a single oil lamp lights a worn manuscript. It's a quiet little gem titled The Absence of Noise in Rooted Things, penned anonymously in 1822. It reads, "We searched for screams in the garden. We found instead stillness. But what is stillness if not a louder kind of knowing? That's the core of it, isn't it? The scream was never about literal sound. It was a metaphor, an attempt to understand what we weren't yet ready to measure: electrical signals, cellular stress, chemical shifts. Things we now know plants do experience. Not as humans do. Not with feelings. But with reactions, patterns, and pulses of quiet survival." Modern science would later discover that plants release airborne chemicals when stressed. That some even respond to vibration. We'll get to that in a minute. But back here, in the early 1800s, they didn't know that yet. All they had were two choices: believe in the scream, or walk away from it forever. And many chose the latter. The Age of Enlightenment put a period at the end of the sentence. For a while, anyway. You find yourself near a display of destroyed manuscripts, half-burnt, mold-eaten, or torn. The placard reads, "Fragments of the Forgotten." You scan the shredded titles. "The Wailing of Wheatgrass." "Do not slice the zucchini at dusk." "My lettuce has a secret." The authors, mostly anonymous. Their work, dismissed, lost, or ridiculed. And yet here it is. Preserved. Behind glass. In silence. Maybe the skeptics won. But the myth. It survived. Because, as you finally exit this quiet hall of logic and linen gloves, you notice something written on the threshold. Not engraved, just scratched faintly into the wood by someone long gone. Still no sound. Still I listen. You step out of the museum into an open courtyard. Stone paths veined with moss. The night sky clear and ink-dark, spattered with stars. A breeze lifts your hair as lanterns sway gently on iron hooks. This is the end of the line, almost. Because just when it seemed like the idea of noisy vegetables had been composted for good, the 20th century arrived. And with it, a new age of wonder, wires, and the irresistible urge to plug cucumbers into oscilloscopes. Welcome to the modern revival. It begins in the 1960s. The counterculture was blooming, and so were ferns in lava lamps. People started questioning everything, including what plants might be feeling. The age of flower power took a surprisingly literal turn, thanks to one former CIA polygraph expert named Cleve Baxter. You probably didn't expect this story to end with a man attaching lie detector electrodes to a houseplant. But yes, Baxter, in 1966, claimed that a Dracaena plant in his office registered an emotional reaction when he thought about burning one of its leaves. He wasn't even holding a match. Just the idea of flame caused a spike on the chart. He called it primary perception. Historians still argue whether Baxter's findings were a misunderstood artifact of equipment sensitivity, a sincere misreading, or a case of confirmation bias on acid. But the results caused a stir, scientific or not. Soon, people were hooking up vegetables to microphones, radios, even early computers. One group claimed tomatoes emitted electrical signals when harvested. Another insisted carrots played ambient noise back at you if you listened closely. It was the punk rock phase of plant research. Uncontrolled, unrepeatable, completely thrilling. And it wasn't just fringe researchers. Even some mainstream scientists started exploring plant neurobiology, a controversial field that, to this day, explores how plants perceive and respond to their environments. Yes, modern research has proven that plants can sense light, gravity, moisture, even touch. They can send chemical distress signals through roots. Some even warn their neighbors of threats like caterpillars. But scream? Not quite. Still, the language persists. You hear scientists say plants communicate or cry out chemically. You read about defense mechanisms described in emotional terms. Why? Because deep down, we want to hear something familiar in the green quiet. And that brings us to perhaps the strangest twist yet: art. In the 1980s, an artist in Amsterdam created a sound installation called The Lettuce Listens. Guests sat in a room while iceberg lettuce heads were wired to synthesizers. The idea was simple. If the lettuce experienced stress, the synths would alter their pitch. People swore they heard the tone shift when they clapped or spoke. Others heard nothing at all. It was ridiculous. It was beautiful. It made people cry. That's the legacy of noisy vegetables, not that they proved themselves, but that they inspired us to ask again and again, what if? What if we're not alone in our reactions? What if we missed something? You walk past a glowing greenhouse. Inside, nightlights bathe delicate basil plants in soft blue. Somewhere, a timer ticks. In a corner, a speaker hums faintly a loop of white noise that someone believes keeps the kale calm. Do they believe it really helps? Or is it just for them? That's the question that echoes through time. How much of this was ever about vegetables? How much was really about humans projecting fear, love, and loneliness onto the only thing that can't talk back? You think of the monks with their whispering carrots, the Enlightenment mystics humming into turnips, the modern researchers with electrodes and hope. All of them, unknowingly, part of the same lineage. The same deep longing to connect to something silent, green, and rooted. There's even a recent experiment, so recent it doesn't feel historical yet, where sound engineers recorded the internal popping of corn kernels as they absorbed moisture. The pops were ultrasonic, inaudible to humans. But when slowed down and filtered, it sounded like tiny crackles. Like whispers. Did the corn say anything? No. Not in any language we know. But people still listened. Still tried. And that's where we land, not with proof, not with certainty, but with a tender sort of maybe. Maybe there's no scream in the cabbage. Maybe there never was. But maybe the world is still alive in ways we're not wired to hear. And so you arrive at the end, standing beneath a pear tree, its leaves rustling faintly in the night breeze. A single fruit falls, soundlessly, into the soft grass. You bend, pick it up, hold it to your ear. Nothing. Of course. And still, you listen. You step away from the garden path now, your pace slowing. The air is cooler here, tinged with dew and the faintest whiff of something green and growing. The noise of the story fades, like a lantern guttering low, and in its place, stillness. You've wandered through centuries, through candlelit labs and misty abbey gardens, down velvet parlors where mystics hummed to roots, and bright white labs where skeptics took careful notes. You've seen people ask wild, beautiful questions about carrots and meaning and whether the cabbage has something to say. And even now, long after the myths faded, long after the scream was labeled a metaphor, those questions echo softly. Not because we expect vegetables to speak, but because part of us still listens, still hopes to feel heard in return. Tonight, that hope can rest. Let the old fears drift off of missing something, of misunderstanding the world. Because even if the vegetables never spoke, you did. You wondered. You looked. You imagined. That's more than enough. So let your thoughts slow. Let the garden grow quiet. No more questions for now. Just this soft hush between leaf and soil, root and sky. You're safe here. You've always been. Close your eyes. Let the wind be the only whisper left. Sleep well.